Hello, and welcome to episode 510 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paridon, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, in his sartorial splendor, is my good friend, fantastic historian and author, John Parshall. How are you this fine afternoon, John?
I am just peachy. I'm in the depths of the editing process with Oxford for my 1942 book, and it's just going great. So yeah. Anyway,
There you go. There you go. Well, if you're watching, you can see that we have a third member of the crew with us today, and it's a new guest, and he is considered one of the foremost naval historians in this country of ours. And for the formal introduction, I'm going to toss it over to my co-host, my pal John. John, take it away.
yeah, because I was trying to think, Craig, how long have we known each other at this point? It's 15 years or something like that.
Well,
Close on.
I could be a smart aleck and say too long, but I'll be
Which,
honest and say not long enough.
there you
But
go. Okay. So Craig is the author of, I think, 17 books now? 18?
18, yeah.
18, look at you. Taught at the Naval Academy for 30 years and then retired briefly and then went back as the Ernest J. King distinguished professor of naval history at the War College. He has won the Gilder Lehrman Prize, the Lincoln Prize, the Roosevelt Prize, the Dudley Knox Medal for Lifetime Achievement, and the 2023 Pritzker Prize for Lifetime Achievement, which is a real biggie too. So yeah, let's just say that when I go to Craig's house and I see the wall of books and awards, I'm like, we are not worthy. We are not worthy. So, but then
Stop it.
you've always got your wife, Mary Lou, to make sure that your head does not expand to to an inordinate size. So we're delighted to have you here with us.
Thanks, John. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So Craig is the most recent book that he has come out with, and I know that Seth and I are
Ta-da!
both rocking our copies here, is Annapolis Goes to War. And that's what we wanted to talk about today because it's pretty apropos with some of the Pearl Harbor stuff that we've been talking about and just Pacific War history in general. But this book details the travails of the Annapolis class of 1940, which was the last class, I believe, that had all 4 years of their education before the war commenced, and also the class that suffered the highest percentage casualties of any class of
Yeah,
any American military academy, I believe. Is that right,
yeah,
Craig?
that is correct.
I guess I would have thought that those honors would have gone to West Point class of
Yeah.
1940, but no.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, you guys have been talking about Pearl Harbor, and we can do a little bit of that here, but I will mention that the class of 40 got what I can guess colloquially call a head start when 10 of their members were all killed at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And just to add some, I always choke up when I say this, but 7 of them are still there inside the
Yeah,
Arizona. So,
right.
those 10, and then of course, a number of them were executive officers and destroyers on the picket line north of Okinawa in
Hmm.
early April of 1945 and suffered undue casualties there as well. So,
Gosh.
76 killed in action during the war is both the highest actual number as well as the highest percentage of mortal casualties in any conflict from any service academy.
Wow. So
Goodness.
how did you get interested in this project? What was the genesis of the
Yeah, that's actually a great question because it allows me to talk about my previous book, which is Nimitz at War.
right?
As you know, John, because we've talked about this. Uh, I wanted to write about Nimitz because I found him such a compelling figure. But of course, studying World War II from the point of view of the Commander in Chief Pacific Fleet, CINCPAC,
Yeah.
means that you're looking at the war from 30,000 feet. It was the largest military theater of the whole war, 65 million square miles. And he was responsible for all of it, not just the Navy, remember, but he's
Yeah.
also a theater commander. So he's in charge of not only the Marines, but the Army Air Corps, the British, the New Zealanders, the Free French, anybody who happened within his command theater, he's the boss. So he
Yeah.
has to look at that from a very elevated perspective. And I focused on his relationships with his often difficult superiors, peers, and subordinates in that conflict. But I wanted to look at the war too from the point of view of the junior officers, the ensigns, the JOs, the second lieutenants, who actually did the fighting. I mean, Nimitz never launched planes or pulled a trigger, but these guys did. And trying to get my handle on that, I was aided enormously by the class of 1940 themselves. And here's one of those amazing stories, which, it's like finding a trunk in the attic with all of the secret papers nobody had ever seen before of somebody famous.
Right.
The class of 1940 at their 45th reunion, so this is the mid-1980s now,
Right.
decided that of those of us who are still living, what gift can we give to the Academy, and particularly those midshipmen who follow us at the Academy, that will help them appreciate the things they're going to be asked to do, the things they will have to do in crises and what it's like and so on. And so they decided that one of their gifts, the major gift, would be that they would each respond to 9 questions. And they wrote them out. Why did you go to the Naval Academy? What do you remember about plebe year? And so on, all the way up to what was your most, traumatic experience in the Second World War. And a few of them kind of said, well, yeah, I went because I thought it was a free education and I was in this ship and that ship and the other ship. But some of them, 30, 40, 50 of them took it seriously enough that they not only wrote about what they did, but how they felt about what they did. So here's a real insight into these guys when they were 20. Well, they started out, many of them, a few of them, 16, but
Right.
as teenagers and then in their early 20s after they graduated. And that resulted in an archive of 19 boxes of personal memoirs and letters and things that they just had stashed in the attic that they shoved in with other things. So I had a huge head start in getting a handle on this particular group. So that's really why I wanted to do the junior officers and why I did this group of junior officers.
Got it. And then I'm assuming there had to be other records and stuff at Annapolis as well, just the normal class registers and all that kind of stuff, right?
That I could look up, their grades, their demerits, and those kinds of things, which some of
That's
them for some reason didn't want to put in their personal memoirs. But yeah, so I had the Naval Academy is a wonderful resource for naval history generally. And of course, I had all of their full collection and the official records. And I'll tell you another really great source is newspapers. Newspapers.com, which you have to subscribe to, is a little bit glitchy now and again. Sometimes it bounces and sometimes it gives you not what you want. But if you stick with it, you can go to the hometown newspapers of each of these guys, little arcane newspapers in Midwestern towns that maybe you never heard of before.
Yeah.
And if they came home on leave or if there was a letter that he sent home to mom and mom told the PTA about it, that would make the local newspaper.
Right.
So that allowed me to get a sense of not only how they felt, but how their families were reacting to the news that they got from the fighting front. So that was helpful.
Right. Yeah, because Rich Frank and I are both really big fans of like the New York Times Time Machine. I'm just
that's amazing.
addicted to that thing, So, but yeah, I hadn't really thought about the hometown papers. That makes a lot of sense going back there. So, what was the size of the class by the time they get to on the eve of 1941? They've graduated in 40, but I know that a number of them. They graduated, but they were not actually offered commissions by the Navy because they didn't have perfect eyesight or whatever. And a number of them end up going to the Army, didn't they?
Yeah, that's true. It's a measure of how often silly rules, and this was one of them, that in order to be commissioned, you had to have 20/20 vision uncorrected. Well, neither you nor I would pass that test, and neither did many of them. 750 men and boys, remember 4 of them are still under 16 years old, show up on what's now called I-Day, Induction Day, in June of 1936. So 750 start. And then there's a gradual attrition, mostly by academics, some by eyesight. 456 get all the way to graduation and get diplomas. But even then, 30 of those who earn diplomas do not get commissions, and it's because of that eyesight thing. In fact, this is a silly statistic, but the number one graduate in the class of 1940, a guy named Joe DeRiso from Los Angeles, California, the top graduate in the class, got a round of applause. Yay! Well done, congratulations, here your diploma, get out. Was not given a commission. Well, somewhat annoyed, as you can imagine, although he knew it was coming. He simply walked over to the Army and said, I'm a graduate of the Naval Academy. What can you do for me? And they said, here's a direct commission as a second lieutenant. He retired 30 years later as a major general. So, you know.
Right. I remember that story. Yeah, right. So then we get to the eve of the war, although I was fascinated just by all the stories about the summer cruises that were happening between each of the class years. And, you know, a number of these future ensigns end up going to Germany in 1937. And are dancing with the young Fraulines and running into SS dudes and whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, remember this is their what they call their youngster cruise. Now in Naval Academy vernacular, first year students are plebes, second year students are youngsters, third year students are segundos or second class, and then firsties are seniors. So these were brand new youngsters. They had just finished their plebe year. Thank God that's over. I won't get harassed as much. And they go on this cruise on 3 battleships, and they head across the Atlantic, and their first port of call is Kiel, Germany. And they get 12 days shore leave, and 60 or so of them, not all of them, but 2 busloads, go down to Berlin and are told to line up. You're going to go shake hands with the Fuhrer. So they go into this room, and Hitler's standing there looking like Hitler. And they walk through and, you know, how do you do, sir? And they shake hands and off they go. It's very pro forma. But I think their experience meant more to them when, as you mentioned, they would run into Army officers who, for example, expected that these guys would get off the sidewalk when they walked by. And not all of them were inclined to do that. So it led to a little chest bumping and you step off, no, you step off kind of stuff in Berlin. And of course, in 1937, that's a little edgy. And then, as you mentioned, they would be dancing with the German Fräuleins. And then at the end of the dance, the band would strike up the German national anthem to signal the end of the day. And all these cute young things would throw their arms up into the air and shout Sieg Heil, which kind of cools your ardor for the young Fräulein. But yeah, their experiences at the academy at a time when the war was underway. Remember, they show up in the summer of 1936, the same week the Spanish Civil War begins, the same week Hitler remilitarizes the Rhineland. They graduate not only the same week, but virtually the same day that the British evacuate the beach at Dunkirk. So their entire 4 years as students of the academy are occupied not only by the quotidian activities of the things they have to do, but by the news they're hearing on the radio and in the newspapers of what's going on in Europe. And then, of course, they soon become part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, you know, one of the things that throughout the book, you're reminded the fact that war clouds are darkening, you know.
Well, I don't think I actually used that line, did I, John? No. I mean, that's a cliche. Come on.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. And your editor and my editor would absolutely, you know, try to stab that through the heart. But I love cliches. I'm sorry. There's a reason they're cliches. It's because they
get used a lot. That's true. They're valuable.
Anyway, war clouds were darkening.
They were indeed. They were indeed.
So by that, we get out. I'm sorry, I'm just blathering here.
No, go.
You had mentioned, okay, so they graduate in 40. 50 of them go to aircraft carriers. 167 end up going to the battleship force. Another 101 go to the cruisers. And there is kind of a pecking order here too, is there not? I mean, the battleship, that was really popular duty because, of course, you know, at that time the battleship was the coin of the realm. So
absolutely. Yeah, you know, the way they pick their service assignments upon graduation nowadays is quite different. The top ranking academic student applies for a particular responsibility, whether it's Marine Corps, aviation, whatever it might be, and he's interviewed and so forth. In those days, you just picked a number out of a hat randomly. And the guy who picked the number one choice, he, of course, chooses a battleship. And the guy who picked the last choice, oh, shoot, I got onto an aircraft carrier. And that reflects, I think, that pre-war attitude that the battleships were going to decide the next war. Well, obviously, that got turned around in quite a hurry.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's go to Pearl Harbor. How many of the class of 1940 was at Pearl Harbor? Do you even have a number for that?
It's over 200.
Wow.
But that includes, most of them were on battleships. And battleships were considered the best postgraduate training ground for new academy grads because they had lots of things to learn. They could be assigned to different departments. They had to keep a notebook with them so they could write down what they were learning day to day. A lot of them felt that what they had learned at the academy, the theory of engineering, the theory of steam, did not help them as much as actually crawling around through a steam plant. So most of them were on battleships. Then there were, as you say, about 50 or so who got onto aircraft carriers. Most of these were young men who had already made the decision they wanted to fly, but the Navy had a rule. No one can go to a specialty training school, submarines, aircraft, anything, until you do 2 years in service combatants. So they had to serve their, let's call it a postgraduate training program, their 2 years, mostly on battleships, which is why a disproportionate number of them were on battleships on December 7th, 1941.
That would make sense. Yeah, I'm just, doing the napkin math in my head. I mean, how many battleships did we have at that time? It was 14 or...
Yeah, there were some in the Atlantic, but the bulk of them were in Pearl Harbor, thanks to FDR, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, so that means that, any one of those battleships has probably got 10 to 12 of these class of 1940 folks on board them.
Minimum of 10. California, USS California, I know had 14.
Wow.
Because they would go ashore together to party, which is pretty much what their pre-war experience was like. So yeah, around 12, a dozen. Let's just say a dozen, typically, on each of the battleships that was in Pearl Harbor on the day of infamy.
Right. Yeah, and 7 of them don't make it off the Arizona.
Right. And 3 are killed in the Oklahoma.
Okay, that's what the other 3 perished.
Right. I should mention, by the way, because it's kind of an interesting thing. One of the things young officers want to do, true now as well as then, you want to qualify for officer of the deck. That's why a lot of officers today who are graduating from the academy who want to go to sea will choose a destroyer or a ship with a relatively small wardroom, because that gives them an opportunity to qualify as officer of the deck relatively quickly. If you can qualify as an OOD within the first year of service, you're on your way. So a lot of these guys are working hard to qualify as officer of the deck. And by December of 1941, a dozen or so of them on various ships had done that. And because OOD duty, when you are virtually in charge of the ship, is easiest when the ship is in port, especially on a weekend, 3 of them were assigned to be officers of the deck on the California, on the Oklahoma, and on the Arizona on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. So 3 of these guys were really at the vortex of the hurricane on that day.
Right.
Go ahead. I was going to say, can you relate some of the experiences of some of these guys? I know I looking through the book, there was Davenport in the Oklahoma. Can you talk about him?
Yeah. Davy Davenport, or Irv, sometimes called, because Irving David Davenport. When you're in port, you're not up on the bridge, you're on the quarterdeck. So you're a little bit lower, you're down where you can see things. And what he recalled in that memoir that he wrote for the archive at the Naval Academy, what he remembered was that he had just come on duty. He had just relieved his predecessor as officer of the deck. He sent the boatswain mate to the stern to raise the flag. He wanted to make sure the bell got rung at exactly 0800. And just a few minutes before that, at about 7:57, here comes a plane flying in low, barely 100 feet off the surface, straight toward him. What the heck is this? I mean, you can imagine the shock of that. I mean, no one's expecting this. And then it drops a torpedo. Well, now that's a wake-up call. And he immediately rang the alarm. He immediately sent for the executive officer. The skipper was ashore. So he related his experiences one by one. And of course, the Oklahoma, being outboard, was hit by, looks like 6 torpedoes.
5 or 6, yep.
5 or 6. And that opened the whole side of the ship opened up in water, millions of gallons of water, and the ship began to list almost immediately. And of course, eventually it would turn all the way over, turn turtle, and go down. But when it went past about 90 degrees, he could no longer hold his post on the quarterdeck. So he's in the water along with his bosun mate and the other people who were on the bridge watch. So he and the other 40s who were on the Oklahoma recorded what they did in that critical 15 minutes between, say, 7:57 and 8:12 that morning.
Man, yeah, as you say, a real eye-opener. And I know you and I have both been on board Missouri, which is now moored in the same spot that Oklahoma was during that attack. And I am always struck when I'm there, just looking out over the Southeast Lock and trying to put myself in the feet of those individuals and imagine what it must have been like to be on a stationary ship watching those planes boring in down the...
Well, it's almost an out-of-body experience because this is so unexpected. I mean, the idea that it was a surprise attack is not news to anyone, but to be the person, the individual standing there while that plane is coming directly at you, it takes an interminable 2 or 3 seconds to kind of adjust your brain to, this is really happening.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm standing here and, oh my God, this thing comes in and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
The thing that struck, I mean, and this is it's not just because they came from the academy, it's any American sailor really, but the fact that this is their baptism of fire. This is for obvious reasons. This is, and everybody else pretty much on board those ships. But they react instantly, all of them.
Yeah.
All of them that are able to physically react instantly. And there's several instances of these guys, of these 40s, saving lives and pulling people out of the water or pulling them out of burning passageways or whatever the case may be. And it goes on. And I mean, they weren't the only ones that did it for sure, but it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And it's just that, that their training just instantly kicks in. And I mean, these guys, they performed like lions on December 7th.
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that members of the Naval Academy Class of 40 were particularly exceptional in any way.
Sure.
One of the reasons I chose them is I think they are representative. I think they're a metaphor almost for all the other men on board those ships, officer and enlisted alike, who after those first few seconds of what the hell did respond, they either by training or by instinct or whatever it might have been, to the necessities of the moment.
Yeah.
There's one guy in your book that you write about. You wrote about him in the Pearl Harbor chapter a lot, and his name was Crosswell Croft.
Yeah.
What was his deal? He had a hell of a story on December the 7th, didn't he?
He did, but also he wrote it very well. I mean, one of the reasons a dozen or so young men from the Class of 40 who carry much of the narrative do so is because they submitted thoughtful write-ups for the archives, and I was able to use that. But Crosswell Croft, who went by the nickname Cross with one S, it was an interesting guy in a lot of ways. He was the company commander of the first company at the Naval Academy and that won the color competition. Now, if you don't know about this is a kind of a big deal at graduation. They keep track of how you perform in intramural sports, what your grade averages are, how you perform in parade. And I mean, there are a lot of indices for determining which company of the 30 that are there now actually perform best during the year. And they are designated the color company. And the guidon flag they carry has a little blue border around the edge. And what that means is that at the graduation parade, the company commander designates someone, a young lady, sometimes a sister, but almost always a girlfriend, to carry the colors. Well, she actually walks with the superintendent with her hand on the staff, symbolically carrying the colors to the middle of the field. And then she passes them from the class of 1940 to the class of 1941. This is the passing on of a tradition that's been there for 150 years. And he was the guy. And he picked his girlfriend, Bobby Eng from Sweetbriar College, to be the color girl. And there was a prescription on the books, in addition to not being able to be trained for specialty combat duty, you could not marry for 2 years after graduation.
Yeah.
Cross did anyway. But he managed to keep it secret and therefore stayed in the Navy. A lot of guys, not a lot, let's say 20 or so, who did get married and got caught, they actually revoked their commissions and kicked them out of the Navy for being married, for crying out loud. But Crosswell Croft was an interesting guy in a lot of respects. The fact that he would defy a Navy reg to do that suggests something about his personality. And he wrote vividly about his activities on December 7th, 1941. And he witnessed some things that clearly seared his memory because he wrote about them so movingly 40 years later. So that's why he's a featured character on that day.
Got it. Yeah. Well, and there are a number of others too. John Lockert.
I love John Lockert.
Yeah.
John Lockert was, I don't know what, a playboy. What do we call him? He was born rich, born handsome, born with connections to everybody. He had a summer home in Hyannisport and used to go sailing with Jack and Bobby Kennedy all the time.
Yeah, and raced yachts against the Kennedys.
What a guy!
Yeah.
And he was smart. He graduated very near the top of the class. But here's the thing about John Lockert: he was a smartass, and he kept getting demerits and graduated almost at the bottom of the class in what was called Grease, which is essentially behavior, deportment, those kinds of things. So he's the kind of guy you'd want to go have a beer with, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and there was this subtext too in his romantic life as well. I mean, he had a longtime girlfriend that ended up breaking up with him, and it sounds like he never really got over that.
Well, he said so. He said, I never really got over this. And I think about what his wife would think. Wait a minute, you're still pining away for your old girlfriend?
What's her face back in Chicago or whatever.
But he got a literal Dear John letter in his youngster year, and she just dumped him. And that was wicked for him.
Yeah. And then got the invitation later to her
wedding. Did not go.
Yeah.
Stick that one in the old heart, why don't you?
Yeah, that's a hard one for sure.
Gracious.
I got to know these guys as I talked about them when I was talking to my wife about what I was working on. I would refer to them as my kids because of course they're full generation and then some older than I. But at the time I got to know them, they were kids, and I kind of watched them grow up from age 17 to age 23. And it was a lot of fun, but I also felt like I knew them.
Right. When did the last one pass? I'm trying to.
2016. It was the last one. Pete Peterson. He was 99 years old when he died, and he was the last of them.
Yeah. So you never actually had a chance to talk face to face.
No, I've talked to many of their children.
Yeah.
And in a few cases, grandchildren. But no, I never met any one of them face to face.
Yeah. Okay, so fast forwarding from Pearl, then we can go to Battle of Savo Island, and there were a number of them present there as well. I don't have an exact count, but Lockert, for instance, is on the destroyer Blue, which infamously is the picket destroyer that was supposed to be guarding the southern channel around Savo Island. And of course, that's the channel that Admiral Mikawa sneaks his force through.
Right.
And I was intrigued to see the mention that Lockert makes in his notes that the Japanese must have much better binoculars and telescopes than we did,
Yeah.
because they saw things that we didn't see because the blue did not detect Mikawa. And I thought that was
right. No, that's true. I mean, I think a little of that is after the fact. I think he was remember he wrote that memoir in response to in '85, and looking back and thinking about it. But clearly, that's the case at the time. One of the things that comes through so clearly in their perception of naval combat, particularly in the Pacific in World War II, was the role that radar, I was going to say did play, but I'm tempted to say didn't play, because I think modern students of the war are not aware of how rudimentary those early radar sets were. The CXAM radars were just, they looked ridiculous. First of all, the bed spring on a mast, as the sailors referred to them. And then you had two separate consoles that gave you possible range and then possible direction, bearing. And you had to conflate these, and you had to hand crank the mast around to get them to conflate. And they were only good for about 12 miles, and they were only good on a straight line. They didn't follow the curvature of the earth. So that the captains in certainly 41, but even through most of 1942, thought radar they just didn't pay any attention to it because it's not really practical to use. They didn't trust it very much. I think that explains what went on at the Battle of Cape Esperance to a certain extent, and well as the naval battle of Guadalcanal. They get these radar reports, and maybe I don't know if I believe that or not, but that was the Blues problem. They had this old surface search radar, air search radar, and they were patrolling the strait between Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal and Savo Island, and so the radar beams bounced off both sides of that strait, giving fuzzy returns, and they never got anything on radar that indicated that Mikawa was going past them in the dark, while Mikawa was watching them through the big eyes.
Well, and not everybody has been to Guadalcanal and actually seen that particular body of water, but when you're standing on, say, Cape Esperance looking north towards Savo, it's like it looks like you could throw a stone across it. And granted, it is actually 7 miles, but 7 miles is not a lot of water when you're talking radar-equipped warships and that sort of thing. So again, the fact that Mikawa was able to sneak through there it's just astonishing when you actually look out over it.
Yeah. Well, I've not been there, but John, I would not be surprised in the least to hear that you can throw a stone 7 miles. I would not be the least bit surprised.
We've actually had that conversation before. There's a certain distance you can throw a baseball, if you recall.
That's right. Which transmuted into how far can you throw a grenade on Okinawa. Yeah.
Right.
So any other, there were a number of other class of 40 folks who were, of course, on some of these cruisers. So Connie Carlson is on the Astoria along with 3 other.
Well, what I did was, there are 4 American cruisers there, and they all had a very, very bad day, or a very, very bad night, actually. So I picked one guy on each of them who had a critical role. They were either on watch or manning a turret during that, and so that I could follow them and the action at the same time. So I hope it allows the reader to feel like he or she is personally on board, and to feel what a surprise that was when, for example, the searchlight just bam lit up your ship out of the middle of the night, just like that. What? And of course, the skippers are as confused as the junior officers. Howard Bode on the Chicago never did figure out what was going on. And I think the others had so little reaction time that there was almost nothing they could do. Poor Captain Reefcold kept blinking out, "Friendly fire, cease fire, you're hitting a friendly ship," until far too late. So I hope that their personal experiences as junior officers allowed people to see that battle, not just from, let's say, 10,000 feet as to what happened, but how it felt. And that was my goal.
Yeah, I really liked Ray Hundevat's story from Vincennes. So he ends up in the water, goes
Yeah.
into the water after the ship has gone down, and he suddenly has this revelation. He too is recently married, but has been sort of hemming and hawing over whether or not he wants to start a family with his wife. As soon as he finds himself swimming around in the drink, he's just like,
Yeah.
next time I see her, we're going to start a family now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that was a
I'm
remark.
glad you brought that up, John,
Yeah.
because I'm going to show you a little show and tell here. Here it is.
Okay.
This is a card that I received in the mail just the other day, and I hope
Okay.
you can read the signature line there at the bottom. Can you? Is that possible?
Yeah. There you go.
Jane Hundevat Pole, who
Okay.
was the product of that decision
Of that
while floating
release.
around in the water,
That's
wrote
beautiful.
me to say, that's nice, very nice letter from her.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, yeah.
So she was his oldest child, I take it.
Well, actually, not quite. She's his second child. The first child, I believe, was oh gosh, Linda or something else. But this is Jane. This is their second child. And she lives in Minnesota. So she read the book and wrote me and said, "Boy, I could see Dad all the way through
awesome.
that. That was for sure. That was Dad."
That's great. Yeah. That's great. So how many were there at Savo? Do we know? How many killed at Savo? Do we know that?
I know this sounds like a cop out. It's in the book. I don't remember. And of course, there were some. Read the book. Yeah, read the book. Better yet, buy the book. There were some, of course, killed subsequently when the cripples were limping back to Noumea, including on the Phoenix, and others that went down afterward. Juno, that's what I meant. Juno, yeah.
Juno. Yeah, I noticed that there was one that was killed on Jarvis. Apparently during the initial torpedo attack. Not that it would have done them any good air attack.
Yeah.
Right, because of course that ship ends up going down with all hands later on. So yeah, what a mess. First naval battle of Guadalcanal. There were two members from the class who were killed, Tom Roddy and John Blodgett. I don't know if you have any more details.
I didn't do much on them. I wanted to mention anyone who had been at the center of the hurricane, and particularly if they had lost their lives. There is, at the beginning of the book, a list of all of those who were killed in the war, 70, whatever it was, 76. But I wanted to mention when it seemed appropriate, the names. But they are among those who did not, because they were killed there, they left no memoir. I mean, there's nothing in the files from them. And their hometown newspapers simply reported their deaths, and, that was it. I just didn't have the kind of detailed information I had from the survivors, who subsequently wrote down what they did and how it felt and so on. So now there were a few cases, and I'll mention Tom McGrath in particular, because Tom McGrath was a big 6'2" strapping guard, All-American guard on the Navy football team, who had been picked as what was called the regimental commander, the top midshipman in the entire regiment, wearing 5 stars on his sleeve when he was a firstie. And remarkably, he chose the submarine service. Now, what else would a 6'2", 240-pound guy choose but the submarine service? But and I would have lost track of him entirely because the submarine on which he was serving, the Pompano, went down with all hands in 1943, and there was no record. We don't know what happened. Even looking through Japanese records afterward, we can surmise, but we're not sure. But it had to go back in for a refit to Bremerton, and he got 2 weeks leave, and he went home to Tucson, Arizona. And a reporter from the Tucson local newspaper interviewed him. He gave a speech to the Kiwanis Club. He went out to watch his former high school football team practice and was interviewed there. So I was able to garner enough information about who he was and how he felt so that even though he didn't survive and he has no archive at the Naval Academy in this collection, I still was able to follow what he did in the submarine service, which is really quite remarkable, actually.
Yeah.
Following
I
the
remember.
breadcrumbs.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that I remember standing in your kitchen, Craig, and you were talking about this project. This is when I was out for the McMullen Symposium. That had been about 2 years ago.
And John, I'm gonna interrupt you to say, you know who was a member of the class of 1940? McMullen.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's funny. Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Now, and I'll be darkening your door again this September as well.
I look forward to it.
I'm afraid. But you mentioned just the sheer number of class members who were then killed in aviation and training in aviation.
Right.
So by the time we get to 1942, a lot of these folks have now served their obligatory 2 years as a surface warfare officer and now are, legit to go to flight training, and a number of them do. Maybe let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. It's a big number. It's 100 and something, and I've forgotten the number. Again, it's in the book.
It's in the book.
But 30 of them are killed in that, and a number of those are killed in action, as you would expect. I mean, flying is dangerous.
Yeah.
But what the statistic that jumped out at me was half of all of those who were killed in training accidents.
Yeah, I thought it was 16 or something like that.
Yeah, and how dangerous it was just to get off the ground in an airplane in 1942, 43.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just, the stories that you would hear, it doesn't matter the plane really. Any plane of that vintage was just dangerous. But, some of them had worse reputations than others, the B-26 Marauder, which obviously is not a Navy plane.
Yeah,
but,
that would be
all sorts of problems, with that thing one a day in Tampa Bay or whatever those things were going down. But in terms of, go ahead.
I was going to say the guys that are training in 1942 and 43, especially in 42, they're using these old beat up old war horses that either have already been worn out in combat or not classified for combat anymore because they suck. TBDs and wind indicators and aircraft like Buffaloes and things like that. They're just beasts,
Yeah, that's true. Well, the early training is all done on what everybody called the yellow peril, the Stearman biplane. I mean, it looks like something Snoopy would use to attack the Red Baron. It's an old World War I vintage biplane held together by wires and struts. But given that, it was a pretty forgiving airplane. It was a good plane for them to train on early on. But as you say, once they got into the next phase and they chose their specialty, dive bombers, torpedo planes, or fighters, then they kind of had to work their way into the frontline fighters like the Hellcat and eventually the Helldiver. The one they did not like was the Helldiver, by the way, the SD-2C.
Nobody did.
Nobody likes that plane.
Oh, they called it the Beast. They hated it. Yeah. And what's funny is that it replaced, of course, the Dauntless, which, like the old Stearman, had less, it could carry less of a payload, which I guess was a downside, but it was more forgiving as an airplane than the Helldiver. So the pilots really liked the old Dauntless better. Yeah.
There's a reason that there's still to this day, a lot of naval aircraft at the bottom of Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
Flying off the Sable and the Wolverine, and they're just going into the water and they're crashing in there because it was a dangerous operation. And again, hell, some of the museum pieces that are around the country that were salvaged were old war horses, and they were beating the snot when they were trying to fly them off of the old SBDs and things like that. And so they weren't flying top of the line aircraft when they were learning how to fly. So accidents were rather common for sure. And there's many reasons why.
Indeed. Absolutely true.
I just think about, a 15 or 16% death rate just to get through training. I mean, if the numbers you're telling me are true,
they're certainly true for that class. I don't know if they're true overall, but they're true for the class of 1940. And of course, what was going on was that they were trying to get pilots out to the front as fast as they could.
Right.
So the training, they trained 7 days a week. They did not have a day off. I think they had 4 hours on Sunday morning that was their own time. Everything else, you were either in ground school or you were in an airplane, and let's go, hurry up. And that probably was a factor as well.
Yeah, that would make sense. Some of these guys turned out to be very good pilots, though, it sounds like.
They did.
Dan Banker at the Battle of Sibuyan Sea, I believe, lands and gets a Silver Star out of the deal as well, right?
Yeah, Don Banker was an interesting guy in a lot of ways. He was known as kind of a cut-up at the Academy. If you look through the log, which is their annual, yearbook, if you would, they described him as somebody who would, if you had grape nuts put in your bed, Don Banker is the guy who did it, that kind of thing. But he, and again, that's a personality type that works well with aviators, by the way, let me point out. But Don Banker's odyssey is a particularly interesting one because he fleeted up to squadron commander during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His squadron commander was killed when he came in low and missed the approach and crashed in the sea, returning to the carrier. And Don Banker became squadron commander. The next day, he leads a flight against Japanese carriers in the Halsey's run to the north. The day before, he had landed a bomb on a battleship. And a week after that, he knew there was a cruiser in Manila Bay, and he led a patrol squadron to get the cruiser, landed a bomb on that. So he either sank or contributed to the sinking of a battleship, a carrier, and a heavy cruiser within 12 days.
That's a pretty solid run.
He got not only the Silver Star, John, but 2 Navy Crosses in 12 days.
Wow.
And then died.
To think too that, I mean, this is 1944 when he's doing this. He graduates in 1940. This is only 4 years after graduation, theoretically. 18 to 24 months after he gets his wings ish.
Right.
That's rather astonishing, frankly.
Right. And I think that's a general comment on this whole class. They had that 18-month period between graduation and December 7th, 1941, where they could, and I have a chapter about this, they would go ashore and the hula girls were dancing and the cocktails were 10 cents and life was good.
Life is good.
But they had to become grown-ups really fast. And they did. And I think that is kind of the central story of their metamorphosis from callow, quivering plebes in 1936 to commanding officers of destroyers 8 years later.
Right. Yeah, and it seems to me, I mean, I would assume that these guys were promoted very rapidly overall as the war is continuing and the Navy is expanding. But it is kind of crazy to think about, a 24-year-old or a 26-year-old commanding a multi-million-dollar vessel with a couple of hundred people under his direct command and his responsibility. But that was just the way things rolled during this war. That's just the
way it was. You adapt and adjust or don't.
Or don't.
Yeah.
Any particular cats in here that did not do well, that maybe failed the test?
I tried not to include those in the book if I could. And we don't know, of course, because if you were not successful, you either didn't make it through the war, which was true in some cases, or you didn't participate in the write-up of what your class did during the war. There was one case, I won't even mention his name, but he's on the Hornet. And others said that he kind of froze up when the Hornet was attacked by torpedo planes and dive bombers and kamikazes. They weren't called kamikazes yet, but 3 of them did crash into the Hornet in the Battle of Santa Cruz Island. And he was right in the middle of all that. And he was supposed to be in charge of a battery of anti-aircraft guns. And they got locked into a vertical position. And there are some who say, well, he wasn't paying attention. I don't know. But I did not find anybody who said, I can't take it, get me out of here.
Yeah, that would make sense.
If there were such people, they probably would have been found out at the Academy anyway.
Yeah.
I was going to say, at the end of the day, I mean, no matter what training you receive, they're humans, and you can't, I don't care how many times you've been under fire, you can't expect to react the same way every single time.
Right.
And if the gentleman, I mean, that's Hornet, that's October 26th, Santa Cruz, that was probably his first time under fire.
Under fire, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't know how you're going to react no matter how much training you get. And I mean,
Right.
having done, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and
I
hundreds
think
of oral
that's
histories, it's just
absolutely
they all say the same
valid
thing.
insight. Yep, I
Yeah,
agree.
they all say the same thing.
Yep.
Yeah. There's only so much you can do.
Mhm.
You also devoted, and I was happy to see this, of at least a subset to some of the graduates who end up in the Marine Corps, because a number
Yeah.
of them end up there as well.
Yeah.
And
A lot. Some people do not know there is no Marine Corps Academy, because the Naval Academy, not Navy Academy, but Naval Academy. So it includes both officers of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps, and that is still true. Percentage of every year's graduates are Marines. If you look out at that sea of eager young people about to be commissioned, some of them are already wearing their Marine Corps uniforms, because as soon as they toss their hat, they can put on that Marine Corps hat and their second lieutenant's bars, and they're good to go. But only 25 members of the class out of the 456 who graduated went into the Marine Corps, because at that time, this is before Pete Ellis's notion that the Marine Corps would be the spear point of the Trans-Pacific offensive against Japan, was widely held. I mean, the idea was known. Obviously, Ellis wrote that article in the 20s. So there were Marines who were thinking about it, but the assumed responsibility of the Marine Corps was the protection of naval bases.
Mhm.
And how many Marines do you need to do that? So only 25 members of the class were allowed. There were others who wanted to. I mean, one of my featured characters is Mike Hanley, who was the captain of the basketball team and ended up going mostly surface line, although he did do some aviation service as well. But he wanted to go Marine Corps, but he was told, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We're full. So, okay. But of these 25, you would expect the loss rate to be particularly high, because, my gosh, these are the guys storming the beaches and throwing satchel charges into pillboxes and just putting their lives on the line every day. And yet, of those 25, there was only one mortal casualty out of the class of 1940.
No.
Yeah.
They did very, very well overall, even having been involved in some pretty grim campaigns. But
indeed,
did not do a similar amount of dying, and good on them. Way to go.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Highest ranking one at the end when they get out of the service?
Well, I didn't really pursue that, to be honest. I know there were a couple of rear admirals. There was at least one brigadier general Marine Corps. We know there were two major generals in the Army. But I wasn't looking for people who excelled. I was looking for people who were representative and who left me the kind of comments and information that would allow me to profile them adequately. But there were a couple of rear admirals, so one in the medical corps, one in surface line. No intel officers, interestingly enough. After the war, many of them got sent to graduate school by the Navy. I mean, here we are in 1946, the war's over. What are we going to do with all these officers? We can't, I guess we could kick them out, but that would be a bit churlish of us. So a lot of them went to graduate school, and a number of those went to law school, interestingly enough. So a number of them got law degrees. Many got engineering degrees at places like MIT and Princeton, Caltech. And then, of course, they went into the usual rotation of service at sea, service ashore. So they had service with NATO commands and things like that, war college students. But most of them retired as 06s, as captains. In fact, of the 10, 12 or so whose post-war experiences I profile at the end of the book, they all retired as captains, except Fred Karch, who's the Marine, who retired as a Marine general.
Got it. Well, I just thought it was a great book. I don't put my name on the rear on the dust.
Yeah, some guy named John Parshall said it was a great book, so it must be
It was a
true.
good book. Yeah, exactly. No,
Thank
I
you for
read,
that, John.
no, and well, I mean, the thing is, I get asked to do that a fair bit, and I won't do it unless I've read the whole damn book, or at least
Yeah.
a respectable chunk of it, because you never know who's trying to bamboozle you. I've got stories around that too. Would you read my crappy book and put your good name on it? Yeah, that's happened to me. Oh man.
Yeah,
But
happened to us all.
yeah, I thought it was a wonderful read. Any
Thank you.
any stories that I missed that
No, and frankly, I don't want to give away all the good stories
Right.
because I want your audience to say, "Wow, this sounds like a great read. I'm going to go get it."
by God it is. So,
It is.
Well,
It
thank
is.
you for that, you
As
guys. I
as they
appreciate it.
all are, frankly. Everyone
Yeah.
you've ever written, as a matter of fact.
You're
Yeah.
very kind. Thank you.
Thanks
All
for
right.
being with us today.
Yeah, this was fun. Anytime you want to have a chat about World War II, feel free.
Yeah.
That's what we do. So
I
we
know you do.
very well may be calling on you again.
We should do yeah, we could even do a whole episode on the flight to nowhere. And I do
Oh,
think
God.
that
Yeah.
Craig's Midway book gives the best coverage of that event of any book in print that I'm aware of. So
That coming from you, that's high praise. Thank you, John.
I loved your Midway book. So
Thank you.
anyway,
Whenever
All
I
right.
hear of that story, I instantly think of Clayton Fisher from VB8.
Yeah, I know.
yeah,
Clay Fisher, he lived after Midway, well into the 60s. He lived across the street from Stan
Oh.
Ring
Oh, wow.
on Coronado Island,
Yeah.
and he refused to speak to them the entire time he lived across the street from him. He
Wow.
despised him.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't want to turn this into a podcast on the flight from nowhere, but I will give one quick question similar to that. One of my colleagues here at the Naval Academy, now retired naval officer who was into submarines, when he was a young ensign and was stationed out in San Diego, he dated Stan Ring's daughter.
Mm.
So he went over to the house one night to pick her up and was brought into the circle. And there's Ring. He's in a wheelchair by now, and he's surrounded by 4 or 5 guys who were making terrible fun of him. Boy, did you go the wrong way. Boy, you didn't know what you were doing. And he just sat there kind of growling. And my friend said, I think we should leave. So, yeah, that cast a long shadow, and we can have a lengthy conversation about that.
That would be fun.
That would be fun. Let's put that down on the list, Seth.
The ever-growing list.
The ever-growing list.
All right.
Exactly. All
Good
right.
deal.
All right. Thank you, guys. This was fun.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Please like and subscribe to our channel if you choose to do so. And if you don't, that's fine too. So once again, my name is what?
Beaten down and jaded in your old podcasting age, Seth.
Oh, gee. Well, because again, like I said last week, nobody listens to it after the major portion of the conversation.
Yeah, that's true.
So.
Yeah, you're right.
So again, we could be doing a song and dance here, and nobody'd ever know.
No.
But anyway, once again, my name is Seth Paridon. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, my co-host, as always, thank you, my good friend, for being here. And
absolutely.
Craig, again, it was a pleasure and an honor to have you here. We will definitely have you back if you're so willing to do so.
Happy to do it.
All right,
have a great
John,
day.
take us out of here, man.
We will see everybody next week.